London, September 7, 1940. 5:30 p.m. The low hum begins like distant thunder. Then the sirens wail, a long rising cry that freezes the city mid-breath. From the Thames to the rooftops of the East End, every eye turns upward. Across the Channel, nearly 1,000 German bombers and fighters slice through the fading daylight. Their target, the heart of London for the first time. The full might of the Luftwaffe descends upon the British capital. Within minutes, the docks are engulfed in fire, warehouses explode and pillars of orange windows shatter for miles. The ground trembles under the weight of impact. In the underground, families huddle close, mothers clutching children, soldiers standing guard. The smell of smoke seeps through the tunnels. Somewhere above, Big Ben tolls through the roar. Prime Minister Winston Churchill watches from the roof of the war rooms, jaw set, eyes fixed on the inferno London burns. But Britain will not bow. That night marks the beginning of the Blitz, a campaign of terror meant to crush a nation's spirit. But Hitler has misjudged his enemy. He has awakened something far stronger than fear. In the summer of 1940, Europe lay in ruins. In just 10 months, Adolf Hitler had achieved what the Kaiser never could. Poland had fallen in weeks, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries. Gone. And then, the unthinkable. France, the greatest army in Western Europe, crushed in only 6 weeks. German troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées as the world watched in disbelief. The swastika flew over Paris. And the Wehrmacht stood at the shores of the English Channel for the first time in 1,000 years. Britain faced the specter of invasion. On June 4, 1940, as 338,000 Allied soldiers escaped from Dunkirk's beaches under fire, one man's voice cut through the despair: Winston Churchill. In the House of Commons he declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." The words were defiance incarnate, but behind them lay grim reality. Britain stood utterly alone. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was still bound by its pact with Hitler. The entire continent of Europe was under Nazi control or influence. The British Army had lost almost all its heavy weapons at Dunkirk. The Royal Navy was overstretched. The Royal Air Force, Britain's last shield, had fewer than 600 frontline fighters to defend an island of 47 million people. Hitler, at this moment, was at the height of his power. His armies had swept across the continent with unprecedented speed. To him, Britain seemed finished, a defiant island led by an obstinate bulldog. He believed that reason, not resistance, would prevail. If Britain could be brought to its knees through threat, terror, or diplomacy, there would be no need for invasion. So he waited. Throughout June and July 1940, Hitler sent peace overtures through neutral channels, offers to allow the British Empire to continue existing if it simply withdrew from the war. Churchill refused them all. To Hitler, this stubbornness was irrational. He couldn't understand a leader who would fight on without hope of victory. But Churchill knew something Hitler didn't, that the British people would not forgive surrender. In Berlin, frustration turned to fury. If Britain would not yield through reason, it would be broken by force. The German High Command began preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. But before any invasion could succeed, Germany needed one thing: air superiority. And so, Erwin Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his air force could destroy the RAF in mere weeks. Once Britain's skies were cleared, the Channel would be open for the Wehrmacht's invasion fleet. Few in Germany doubted it. The Luftwaffe had crushed every enemy so far. Its Messerschmitts and Stukas had ruled the skies over Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Paris. The stage was set for the Battle of Britain, the first great air campaign in history. But before that battle began, something remarkable happened across the Channel. In towns, villages, and cities across the United Kingdom, people began preparing for what felt inevitable. Barricades went up along beaches, civilians dug shelters. The government distributed gas masks to every household. Propaganda posters urged calm and courage. Keep calm and carry on. It was not empty bravado. Britain was bracing for a storm unlike any before. The threat was not just military, it was existential for Hitler. Conquering Britain meant extinguishing the last beacon of democratic resistance in Europe. For Churchill, survival itself would be victory. And so, in the warm summer of 1940, while German armies celebrated their triumphs on the continent, Britain stood alone, a single island fortress waiting for the next blow. The question was no longer if Hitler would strike, but how. By July 1940, the German war machine turned its gaze across the Channel. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, could not proceed until one crucial condition was met. The Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force. Hitler's plan was straightforward in theory. Unleash waves of bombers and fighters to cripple airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Once the RAF was broken, Britain would be defenseless. Then, and only then, would the Wehrmacht's landing craft cross the Channel. But beneath the simplicity of that plan lay a fatal underestimation. The Germans believed the RAF was weak, poorly organized, and exhausted after Dunkirk. They were wrong. At the heart of Britain's air defense stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a quiet, calculating commander nicknamed Stuffy for his reserved manner. Dowding was a visionary who understood that Britain's survival depended on precision, not panic. Dowding, alongside Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, built a defense network unlike anything the world had seen, a combination of radar, ground observers, and rapid communication. The Germans didn't yet grasp how revolutionary this system was. From radar towers dotting the southern coast came early warnings of incoming raids. Information flowed through Dowding's filter room, a nerve center that tracked every formation of enemy aircraft in real time. It allowed the RAF to scramble fighters exactly where they were needed, conserving precious pilots and fuel. It was the world's first integrated air defense network, and it would soon prove decisive. Meanwhile, Hitler placed his trust in Ermann Göring, the flamboyant and self-assured commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring had promised an easy victory. His pilots called him Der Dick, the Fat One, and adored his bravado. He believed that the Luftwaffe could bring Britain to its knees through air power alone. On August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag, Eagle Day. The opening assault of the Battle of Britain, hundreds of bombers roared over the Channel, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109s, to strike at radar masts and RAF bases. The skies of southern England became a chaotic battlefield, contrails twisting like scars across the blue, parachutes drifting down like ghosts. Fighter command was stretched to its limit. Pilots scrambled 3, sometimes 4 times a day. Many never returned. But even as airfields were hit and hangars burned, the RAF endured. The British radar network, though damaged, remained functional, and beneath Dowding's calm control, fighter command refused to collapse. Then, on August 24th, a single German bomber lost its way in the darkness and dropped its bombs not on airfield, but on London. The attack was unintended, but it would change the course of the war. In response, Churchill ordered the RAF to bomb Berlin. The damage was minimal, but the symbolism was seismic. The German capital, untouched since the war began, had been hit. Hitler was furious. He ordered Göring to shift the Luftwaffe's focus from RAF bases to London itself. It was a decision driven by rage, and one that would ultimately save the RAF. By abandoning their strikes on radar and fighter airfields, the Germans gave Britain's air defenses time to recover. The Battle of Britain entered a new phase, one of vengeance and terror. On September 7, 1940, just after 5 p.m., the first massive daylight raid struck the capital. That evening, London burned from the docks to the city center. Firefighters fought through collapsing buildings. The Thames ran red with reflection. This was no longer a military campaign. It was a war on civilians. Hitler believed he could bomb Britain into submission. He believed terror would shatter morale, that the people would turn on their government, and that Churchill would be forced to sue for peace. But he was wrong. The flames of London would not destroy Britain's spirit, they would forge it. And as the Blitz began, the war ceased to be one of airfields and armies. It became a battle for the soul of a nation. Every night, as darkness fell, Britain held its breath. The sirens began their mournful cry, and across the cities, people dropped what they were doing and made for shelter. By late 1940, millions of civilians lived by a grim routine. Sleep by day, survive by night. The London Underground became both sanctuary and symbol. Families descended the spiral staircases with blankets, food, and hope. Trains still ran, but the platforms were crowded with cots and faces lit by candlelight. Children slept to the rhythm of distant explosions. In the streets above, the air raid precautions wardens, volunteers in tin helmets, patrolled through the smoke, shouting, "Put that light out!" to preserve the blackout. The fire brigades fought exhaustion as much as flames, racing through burning streets where hoses froze or burst under debris. The smell of wet ash and cordite lingered over the city every dawn. Yet, when the all-clear siren finally sounded, people emerged from shelters, dusted off their clothes, and went to work as if nothing had happened. Factories resumed production, trams ran, shops opened. It was as though defiance itself had become a daily habit. This stoic endurance became known as the Blitz spirit. It wasn't joy or bravado, it was resilience born of necessity. As one Londoner later recalled, "You just carried on what else was there to do." If the people were the heart of Britain's resistance, Winston Churchill was its voice. He understood that morale could be as decisive as any weapon. His speeches were not mere words, they were acts of leadership under fire. Night after night, Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods. He walked among the rubble-strewn streets, cigar in hand, listening to survivors. Photographs show him standing amid the ruins of the East End, hat tilted, jaw clenched, a man absorbing the pain of his people and returning it as strength. When he spoke to Parliament or on the radio, his words reached every shelter and home. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say." This was their finest hour. He refused to hide the truth. He told the nation the war would be long. The loss is terrible, but the cause righteous. His defiance gave form to the people's endurance. Churchill's government also mastered the power of information. The Ministry of Information coordinated propaganda films, newsreels, and posters reminding citizens that calmness and courage were themselves acts of war. Through this, Britain's leadership turned civilian suffering into a source of unity. The Blitz became not only a trial, but a shared identity, an ordeal survived together. While the streets burned, another battle raged silently, in the air and on the screens of radar operators along the coast. Britain's survival hung on the thin, flickering lines of radio waves. Radar, or RDF, radio direction finding, as it was then known, was still new, secret, and experimental. It allowed the RAF to detect incoming raids long before they reached the coast. Operators, often young women barely out of school, watched green blips slide across their screens, reporting positions by phone to plotting rooms. This system, called the Doubting System, connected radar stations, command centers, and fighter squadrons into one unified defense grid. It was Britain's unseen advantage, one the Germans never fully understood. Above, in the skies, the pilots of the Royal Air Force fought with unmatched intensity. Flying Hurricanes and Spitfires, they faced superior numbers day after day. Many were barely 20 years old. They called themselves simply the Few when Churchill later said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He meant them, the men who held the line between freedom and fascism. Each aerial duel was brief, brutal, and often final. Pilots returned to bases riddled with bullet holes. Some crash landing on their own airfields, others vanished into the channel without a trace. But the RAF endured, powered by radar, discipline, and determination. For every bomber that slipped through, several were shot down. By September's end, the Luftwaffe had failed to break fighter command. Technological innovation and human courage had merged, a nation's brain and heart working as one. And while the machines of war filled the sky, it was the spirit of endurance below that gave the battle its meaning. Inside Hitler's headquarters, reports arrived daily, bomb tonnage dropped, fires seen from reconnaissance aircraft, city blocks destroyed. To the Nazi leadership, these numbers meant progress. To the British, they meant another night survived. The Luftwaffe, at the peak of its might, entered the Blitz campaign with over 1,500 bombers and 1,200 fighters. It was a formidable force, well-trained, battle-tested, and confident. Hermann Göring boasted to Hitler that Britain's cities would crumble in weeks. But arrogance became the Luftwaffe's blindfold. Their intelligence was shallow. They had no real understanding of Britain's radar network or its command structure. They assumed that the British people, softened by comfort and democracy, would panic under sustained bombing. Instead, the opposite happened. Each raid that failed to break morale only strengthened it. Every destroyed building became a symbol of defiance. The Luftwaffe's own structure worked against it. Göring's centralized command stifled initiative. Bomber crews grew exhausted from constant sorties. The RAF, by contrast, adapted quickly, learning the German patterns, improving interception tactics, and rotating squadrons to keep pilots fresh. By late 1940, German losses began to mount. Bombers were shot down in growing numbers, while British production quietly replaced damaged fighters faster than the Luftwaffe anticipated. In Berlin, frustration replaced confidence. Hitler could not comprehend why the British spirit refused to crack. He mistook endurance for weakness, a misjudgment that would echo later in his campaigns against the Soviet Union. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility began to waver, not through conquest, but through resistance. Before the Blitz, Britain was a divided nation, by class, by wealth, by geography. The aristocracy lived far from the industrial heartlands, and the working class of London, Birmingham, and Liverpool lived lives worlds apart. But in the firestorms of 1940, those divisions began to blur. When the bombs fell, they fell on rich and poor alike. The East End may have taken the brunt of the raids, but even Buckingham Palace was hit, twice. When Queen Elizabeth visited the rubble and declared, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face," it struck a chord across the nation. The Blitz had become a great equalizer. Civilians of every background now shared the same fear and the same courage. Psychologists at the time feared mass hysteria. Government studies even predicted mental collapse in the population under prolonged bombing. But what emerged was something else entirely: communal resilience. Communities formed nightly rituals, checking on neighbors, sharing food, singing in shelters. People joked that Jerry, the German bombers, was now part of their evening routine. The humor was dry, defiant, and deeply British. One woman wrote in her diary, "It's strange how one can get used to anything. The bombs fall, and you listen. If they're close, you duck. If not, you finish your tea." This transformation, from fear to fatalism to unity, became the psychological armor that Hitler could never penetrate. The Blitz, intended to divide, had done the opposite. It bound a people together, not in victory, but in shared survival. Even as buildings fell, Britain refused to let culture die. Cinemas reopened the morning after raids. Theaters performed through shattered windows. Newspapers printed by candlelight, reminding the public that normal life still existed, even in fragments. Music, too, became a weapon of morale. The voice of Vera Lynn, the force's sweetheart, drifted from radios across the country. Her songs, "We'll Meet Again," "The White Cliffs of Dover," carried promises of reunion and peace, even as the bombs thundered overhead. In art and film, the government quietly encouraged the narrative of quiet heroism. Documentaries like London Can Take It were shown abroad, portraying the stoicism of everyday citizens. The world began to see Britain not as a beaten island, but as a fortress of courage. Even religion took on new meaning. Churches that survived raids became symbols of divine endurance. When St. Paul's Cathedral stood untouched amid the flames, its dome illuminated against the inferno, the photograph became legendary. It seemed to prove that London itself was unconquerable. In the shelters, children drew pictures of airplanes and stars. In pubs, jokes masked fear. In homes, families taped windows, boiled tea, and carried on. The Blitz had become more than a campaign of war. It was a battle of spirit versus annihilation, and Britain's culture itself was the weapon of resistance. In the end, Hitler's air offensive achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of submission, it bred solidarity. Instead of despair, it forged identity. Each bomb that fell deepened a quiet collective vow: Britain would never yield. But even unity and courage have limits. The raids grew heavier, deadlier, and more relentless. By the winter of 1940, the flames reached new heights, and Britain was about to face its hardest nights yet. Winter 1940. For 3 relentless months, the bombs had fallen. But as autumn gave way to winter, the Blitz entered its most savage phase. The Luftwaffe now struck not only London, but also Britain's great industrial centers: Birmingham, Coventry, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow. Each city was a target, each night an ordeal. On November 14, 1940, just after 7 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across Coventry, a city of 200,000 people, known for its medieval charm and its factories producing aircraft engines and munitions. That night, the Luftwaffe unleashed over 500 bombers in coordinated waves. They dropped more than 500 tons of high explosives and 30,000 incendiary bombs. Within minutes, the city's water mains burst, cutting off firefighting efforts. The flames spread unchecked through narrow medieval streets. Eyewitnesses recalled the sky glowing red for miles. An RAF observer watching from 60 miles away wrote that the horizon looked like a sunrise. Coventry's ancient St. Michael's Cathedral, dating back to the 14th century, was struck repeatedly. Its spire, once a symbol of peace, collapsed in flames. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable, an inferno turned to ash. Over 500 people were killed that night, and thousands injured. When Churchill received the reports, he was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Coventry has suffered, but she will rise again." In the days that followed, German propaganda coined a new word: Coventrated. It meant total annihilation by air power. But the word never entered the English language the way they intended. In Britain, Coventry became a symbol, not of defeat, but of endurance. London remained the heart of Hitler's campaign of terror. Night after night, it endured a drumbeat of destruction. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the city was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. On December 29, 1940, came one of the most devastating raids of the war, later called the Second Great Fire of London. German bombers dropped over 10,000 incendiaries on the capital's heart, the City of London historic streets. Churches and offices were engulfed. The Guildhall, the Old Bailey, and much of Fleet Street burned. Firemen, many volunteers, battled the flames with barely enough water pressure to reach rooftops, one recalled. The heat was so fierce the soles of our boots melted amid the inferno. A single image captured the world's imagination. Photographer Herbert Mason, working for the Daily Mail, climbed to the roof of his building, and saw St. Paul's Cathedral standing tall, wreathed in smoke but unbroken. He pressed the shutter and immortalized the moment. When the photo appeared, it became an instant emblem of hope. While the rest of London burned, St. Paul's still stood. To many, it seemed like divine proof that Britain's spirit could not be consumed. By early 1941, Britain's endurance was being tested to its limits. Food supplies ran low, fuel was rationed. Air raid shelters overflowed. The London Underground had become a nightly city beneath the city, a world of bunks, tea urns, and whispered songs. Children slept while bombers droned overhead. Couples fell in love in the dim light of tunnels. Life persisted even where daylight never reached. Above ground, London's landscape had changed beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, smoke hung permanently in the air. Every morning, rescue workers combed through rubble for survivors. The cost was immense. More than 40,000 civilians killed and millions made homeless. But Britain's rule remained unbroken. Churchill continued to walk through the ruins, cigar clenched, nodding to crowds who cheered through dust and debris. He wrote in his diary, "These people, who have been under this storm for so many months, never flinched or wavered. Their spirit remains unconquerable, while civilians bore the brunt." The Royal Air Force quietly began to shift the balance. The Luftwaffe had hoped to destroy the RAF, but by the winter of 1940, the opposite was happening. British radar had grown more efficient, night fighter technology was improving, and intelligence gathering, including code breaking at Bletchley Park, was sharpening. German pilots were now flying long missions over hostile territory, at night, often with poor navigation aids. British Hurricanes and Beaufighters began intercepting bombers more frequently, turning the night sky into a deadly maze for the Luftwaffe. Losses mounted: aircraft, crews, morale. Still, the raids continued. Hitler would not admit failure. But deep within the Reich Air Ministry, commanders knew the truth. The Blitz was not breaking Britain, it was exhausting Germany. The climax of destruction had arrived. From Coventry's ashes to London's glowing horizon, Hitler's air terror reached its peak and began to falter. But the decisive shift, the moment when the Blitz truly began to fail, would come not from courage alone, but from strategy, fatigue, and the turning tide of war itself. By February 1941, the Blitz had become a grim routine. The people of Britain no longer asked if the bombers would come, only when. The wail of sirens was part of life, as familiar as the sound of church bells. But under that constant strain, something subtle began to change. The Luftwaffe was tiring. Germany's attention was turning eastward, toward a new and far more ambitious target, the Soviet Union. Hitler's obsession was already fixed on his next campaign, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He believed Britain was finished, merely waiting for the final blow. He told his generals that once Russia was defeated, Britain would have no choice but to surrender. This strategic arrogance would be one of his gravest mistakes. By diverting resources from the air war over Britain to preparations in the East, Hitler ensured that the Blitz would wither before achieving its goal. Throughout the spring of 1941, German bomber strength over Britain began to decline. Fuel was diverted to the Eastern Front. Air crews were redeployed. The once mighty Luftwaffe was stretched thin. And yet, the attacks continued, a cruel echo of a campaign that had already failed. In March and April 1941, the bombers struck again: Plymouth, Bristol, Portsmouth, Belfast. Each raid was devastating, but no longer decisive. The people no longer panicked. They adapted. Emergency services responded faster, evacuation plans were smoother. Shelters were reinforced, and food distribution more efficient. Even propaganda evolved. The BBC broadcast calm, clear news bulletins each morning, the voice of stability amid chaos. By now, the government understood that fear could be managed and morale could be engineered. when Plymouth was hit with waves of incendiaries, destroying nearly 2/3 of the city center. The local paper appeared the next day with a single headline, "Plymouth still stands." It became a refrain across the nation. By night, the RAF had begun to take its revenge. British bombers, though still crude in navigation and accuracy, began striking German cities in return. At first, these raids were limited, symbolic. But psychologically, they marked a new phase. Britain was no longer only enduring. It was fighting back. In March 1941, the RAF carried out one of its largest raids yet on Hamburg. Berlin, Cologne, and Bremen were also hit. Though the damage was limited, the message was clear. Britain had survived, and it could strike deep into the Reich. For the German people, this was unsettling. For Hitler, infuriating. But the Luftwaffe could no longer suppress it. Its bomber crews were depleted, its aircraft worn, its strategy crumbling. Every month, the British defenses grew stronger while German resolve weakened. By May 1941, the Blitz reached its final crescendo. On the night of May 10th to 11th, London endured one of the heaviest raids of the war. Over 700 bombers dropped more than 700 tons of explosives. Historic landmarks, the Houses of Commons, Westminster Abbey, the British Museum, all suffered damage. But when dawn broke, something remarkable happened. The people came out as they always had. Buses ran, shops opened, workers cleared rubble, and returned to duty. The Blitz had lost its power to terrify. That same month, another event symbolized the end of the campaign. Ermengring's deputy, Rudolf Hess, flew solo to Scotland on a bizarre peace mission, an act that stunned the world. It was proof of disarray at the heart of the Nazi regime. Only days later, Hitler officially postponed Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain, the dream of conquering the island, was over. By June 1941, the Luftwaffe's bombers were no longer heading west across the Channel. They were flying east toward Russia. The Blitz had ended, not in triumph, but in exhaustion and redirection. Its toll was staggering: 43,000 civilians killed, 139,000 injured, over 1 million homes destroyed. Yet Britain stood unbroken. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF, failed to force surrender, and failed to crush morale. In the ashes of London, something new had been born, a sense of collective identity that transcended fear. The Blitz had been meant to break the nation's back. Instead, it welded it together. On the evening of May 11th, after the final great raid, Londoners gathered near the ruins of St. Clementine's Church. A choir, dusty, tired, unshaken, began to sing softly amid the rubble. "There'll always be an England, and England shall be free." Above them, the sky was quiet for the first time in months. No engines, no sirens, only silence. The Blitz was over, but its impact would echo far beyond the smoke and stone of 1941. For it had proven something Hitler had never understood, that terror can destroy buildings, but not conviction. And as the bombers turned east, Britain, though scarred, remained standing, a defiant island that had refused to fall. But survival was only the beginning. What came next was the reckoning, the price paid, the lives lost, and the unity forged in fire that would shape the rest of the war. When the final bombs fell in May 1941, Britain looked like a nation gutted by fire. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to blackened shells. More than 2 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Factories, schools, and hospitals lay in ruins. And yet, amid the devastation, life pulsed on. Milk deliveries continued, newspapers printed, daily trains ran through cratered stations. In London, vendors sold tea on street corners surrounded by rubble. It was not denial, it was defiance. The Blitz had not defeated the British people. It had hardened them. The human cost was immense. Official records list over 43,000 dead, But behind each number was a name, a family, a story. Entire streets vanished overnight. In Coventry, one raid alone killed more than 500 civilians and destroyed the city's cathedral, a wound that would come to symbolize Britain's suffering. Children who had been evacuated to the countryside returned months later to find their homes gone. Families searched for missing loved ones in hospital wards and makeshift morgues. The trauma would linger for decades, the sudden flash of light, the whistle of bombs, the silence after impact. And yet, even through grief, the nation held together. Volunteer rescue teams, wardens, and medics, men and women of every class, worked side by side in the darkest nights. The British spirit of endurance became its own weapon. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. Throughout the Blitz, he visited bombed sites, walking through debris with his ever-present cigar and bowler hat. His presence was both symbolic and deeply human, a leader sharing the risk of his people. He gave no false promises. He offered only resolve. His words, broadcast by radio, carried through bomb shelters and shattered streets. "We shall not flag or fail, we shall go on to the end. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be." The Blitz transformed Churchill from a wartime politician into a national figure of mythic endurance. He became the embodiment of Britain's refusal to kneel. Hitler had hoped that the bombings would cripple Britain's industry. But the opposite occurred. Despite severe damage, key production centers, aircraft factories in the Midlands, shipyards in the north, munitions plants scattered across the countryside, continued to operate. Workers slept beside their machines, emerging from shelters at dawn to resume work amid dust and broken glass. The British output of aircraft actually increased during the height of the Blitz. By early 1941, Britain was producing more fighter planes than Germany. This astonishing fact was proof of an industrial system that refused to collapse, supported by an unwavering civilian workforce. The Blitz had tested not only morale but also logistics, and Britain passed that test. Across the Atlantic, the images of burning London had a profound effect. American journalists like Edward R. Murrow broadcast live from rooftops, describing the city under fire. His words, "This is London carried into American homes," painting a portrait of courage under siege. Public opinion in the United States began to shift. Isolationist voices quieted as Americans watched a small island nation stand alone against tyranny. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the symbolic weight of Britain's endurance. In December 1940, he gave his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, promising support for those resisting aggression. The following year, the Lend-Lease Act was signed, a turning point that would funnel vital supplies, aircraft, and weapons to Britain. Without that moral and material bridge, survival might have been impossible. The Blitz had not only failed to break Britain, it had drawn America closer to war. By the summer of 1941, the Luftwaffe was gone from British skies. Its bombers flew east into the vast and freezing frontiers of Russia. There, German air power would be swallowed by the scale of the Eastern Front and by Soviet resilience. Britain, meanwhile, could breathe again. But the scars of the Blitz, physical and emotional, would remain. From the wreckage of the cities rose a new kind of national pride, quieter but unshakable. A belief that if they could survive this, they could survive anything. The morning after the Blitz ended, London was a landscape of ruins and resolve. Rows of gutted buildings lined the Thames like open wounds. Yet everywhere, in the same streets where fire had raged, the Union Jack hung from shattered windows, tattered but defiant. The message was unmistakable: we are still here. The Blitz changed Britain more profoundly than any event in its modern history. It erased old class lines and forced unity through shared suffering. Aristocrats and factory workers took shelter side by side. Soldiers returning on leave found themselves shoulder to shoulder with dockers, miners and shopkeepers, all enduring the same nightly siege. The concept of the People's War was born, a term that would define the British home front. The government, once distrusted, now appeared as a partner in survival. Citizens who had once felt powerless discovered agency, volunteering as air raid wardens, firefighters, ambulance drivers, or members of the Home Guard. The Blitz had turned endurance into democracy. Hitler's plan had rested on one assumption, that terror could break the will of the British people. Instead, it had forged a collective calm, almost stoic in its precision. Psychologists studying wartime behavior later coined a phrase for it: the British way of resilience. Communities adapted instinctively, developing humor, ritual, and solidarity. Children sang songs in the shelters. Pubs reopened after raids. Weddings continued amid ruins. This defiance was not bravado, it was a weapon, a psychological counterattack against the Reich. As one Londoner wrote in her diary, "If Hitler wants to make us afraid, he's chosen the wrong people." By surviving, Britain had inflicted a deeper defeat than any battle could measure, a moral one. When the war finally ended in 1945, the scars of the Blitz guided Britain's reconstruction. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Architects and planners reimagined cities not just as replicas of the past, but as symbols of renewal. London's new skyline, from the modernist housing estates to the post-war rebuilding of the St. Paul's precinct, was shaped by that era of destruction. Each stone laid was an act of remembrance. Financially, the war had drained the empire, but socially, it had transformed it. The shared suffering of the Blitz laid the groundwork for post-war reforms, including the creation of the National Health Service and expanded welfare programs. The government understood that a nation that had endured together deserved to recover together. The Blitz, in that sense, built more than walls. It built a new Britain. Abroad, the imagery of the Blitz endured as one of the defining symbols of World War II. Photographs of Londoners calmly reading newspapers, amid rubble, or firemen silhouetted against burning buildings, became emblems of courage under siege. The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," once an obscure government slogan, found its true meaning through those nights of bombing. For occupied nations across Europe, Britain's survival was proof that Nazi Germany could be resisted. For the United States, it was a moral call to arms, a reason to fight alongside the last free nation in Europe. The Blitz had failed as a military strategy, but succeeded in galvanizing the Allied cause. For the Luftwaffe, the campaign was a strategic disaster. Its bomber crews, once hailed as the pride of the Reich, returned demoralized and depleted. Hitler's dream of a swift victory in the West had evaporated. And when the war turned eastward, Germany faced a far more brutal and costly struggle. Historians later noted that the Blitz marked the moment when Germany's momentum began to falter, the point where its aura of invincibility cracked. The Reich had failed to subdue a nation that had stood alone. Years later, survivors of the Blitz still spoke of those nights with quiet pride, not for the suffering, but for the solidarity. They remembered the sound of church bells ringing after the all-clear, the taste of tea brewed over makeshift fires, and the sight of St. Paul's Cathedral standing unscathed amid smoke and ruin, a miracle that became a symbol of hope. Even in the darkest times, they had found light. The Blitz had begun as an act of terror. It ended as a testament to endurance. The Blitz was not merely a campaign of destruction. It was a test, a trial by fire that measured the resilience of a people, the ingenuity of leadership, and the limits of terror as a weapon. For Hitler, it was meant to crush a nation into submission. For Britain, it became a forge in which national identity, morale, and unity were tempered. Buildings could burn, streets could vanish, lives could be lost. But courage, once kindled, could not be destroyed. The image of St. Paul's Cathedral rising above the flames became more than a photograph. It became a metaphor. Even in the midst of chaos, order and spirit could endure. Even as German bombers carved fire across the night sky, the British people carved resilience into their daily lives. Strategically, the Blitz exposed Hitler's miscalculations. He had assumed fear could replace strategy, terror could replace planning, and destruction could replace determination. Instead, it revealed the power of coordinated defense, technological innovation, and human will. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, had met an enemy it could not break, a lesson that would echo throughout the rest of the war. Culturally, the Blitz reshaped Britain. It blurred class divisions, fostered solidarity, and gave birth to the concept of the People's War. It reminded a nation and the world that true strength lies not only in weapons or armies, but in shared endurance, in courage under pressure, and in hope forged amid rubble. When the last bomb fell, Britain remained standing. The Blitz had left scars, both visible and invisible, but it had also created something indestructible, a collective spirit that could endure fire, fear, and isolation. In the end, the Blitz was not a victory for Hitler, but a triumph of humanity. A nation had been tested, a city had burned, and a people had survived, not because the skies were empty, but because their hearts were unyielding. History would remember the bombs, the rubble, the loss, but it would also remember the courage, the unity, and the flame of a nation that refused to be extinguished. The story of the Blitz is a story of endurance, a reminder that in the darkest nights, the human spirit can shine brighter than any fire from above.